So I was, let's see, I was 19, and at the age of 19, I was determined to talk to my mother about a few things. Around that time, I had been very active socially in feminist groups and also in ACT UP. So we have to imagine that this is still within the curve of the AIDS crisis, particularly for Perth, Western Australia. And probably even before that, I started to open myself up to people who are outside of my social context in the outer suburbs and who were much closer to the city. I was going to a college. I was studying my year 12 after having dropped out of school and being very depressed. I couldn't cope with school. I mean, I could cope academically, but the education there was really shoddy. And also, I was going through crisis. I didn't really understand my crisis or crises at the time. I remember not feeling good in my body. That's true. I remember drawing an outline of my body, looking at it in the mirror and thinking, what is this strange object? Trying to understand its contours, trying to understand what it had become or what I had become. I guess I kind of entered into puberty quite late. And so my sense of self, prepubescent, was quite a long-running period, and I was smaller than most of my peers. At the time, you could actually say, little Anglo-South Asian kid. If I look back on those photos, I can see it. But as I started to mature, I had all sorts of conflicts with that. I remember at the age of 15, some years before I dropped out of school, I got my first girlfriend and couldn't carry out the things that a typical teenager would do, except beyond a little bit of intimacy, and there was a real block for me. Fast forward a few years, and I'm hearing from people about then what we call gay and lesbian politics and the AIDS crisis and the increasing push to be in your face about these things. I'm getting exposed to that political effervescence in the face of crisis. And I just thought people around me were brilliant. I thought these young people, I was young obviously as well, still a teenager, who were getting active and militant, whether they be sexual in the field of sexual health activism or around feminism, were just my kind of people. They helped me to understand family life better. We didn't have the term heteronormativity back then, but we talked about homophobia. I hadn't met at that stage many trans people like myself, but it wasn't unknown to me. I remember the first time I went into a library and I looked up at, I think it was in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the word transsexual, and there was the immediate recognition, but I didn't come out as trans at that stage. I did talk to my mum about me being different, and I kind of mixed up the issues around what I thought about it as sexuality and my experience of sexual abuse in the family. That was really foolhardy to talk about those topics together, because I think for people who don't understand what it is like to be different in terms of your orientation, the question of child sexual abuse, especially at the hands of an adult male, can kind of cloud the issue. But I was being suitably in your face, and I forced my way into the open. I remember telling my mom that I wasn't interested in forming relationships with girls. I'd never had a same-sex relationship. I just kind of was getting very influenced by that way of thinking about myself. I was a very feminine young person, and always was, and that was a bone of contention between my parents. I was always targeted, especially by my father, who was also responsible for the abuse, due to my perceived girliness, not being a proper boy. And also I ran the risk of the same at school, but I managed to escape the worst of it by being the nerd. That's a lot to sort through, including with the sexual abuse scenarios. And I know these are really trigger topics and so on, but when I finally had declared these things and kind of removed myself from the family environment, well, first of all, I didn't get acceptance from my mother, but she said to me, "You're asexual." That was her version. And I remember being quite shocked hearing her say that. But, maybe that was just her word, try to understand my difference. She saw it, yeah. And my mum also accepted transsexuality. She had a different way of looking at it than other people, I guess, in the West. And she really believed in, the soul level kind of thing, and that were potentially linked to people who had dispositions over lifetimes through reincarnation. This is a very South Asian or Indian kind of way of looking at the issue. But needless to say, I didn't have the resources or understanding to be able to say, I feel like I am a girl. Even though everything pretty much pointed that way. And I had body issues. That was what was at the heart of it. Not necessarily desire for persons of the male gender, but I guess it hadn't really completely cohered in me because I had no reference points. I had a word, transsexual, but there were no resources, there was no support, and it was actually considered to be very unusual and even deviant, right? It pains me to say those words. Of course, there are still people who think about transsexuality that way. When I got away from the family environment, and here I'm not actually tarring with the same brush as my siblings, talking more about my parents and the rejection of my sexuality as I framed it then, I began to explore my gender and gender presentation and stuff like that, and I was very androgynous, and I kind of thought about the idea of transition then as well. I even picked out a name and that kind of thing, but getting treatment back then was an obstacle course, not easy. Very different to now. I had transsexual friends, but I just kind of lived with this kind of ambiguity around myself. As a young person, I did read, the first wave of transgender writings, such as by Leslie Feinberg, Kate Bornstein, or Bornstein, I don't know how she actually says her name, but also Ricky Wilchens, Read My Lips, and I found that work really powerful. And I was really inspired, and, I was holding a place for that. I was holding a place for it in terms of, I guess, the kind of, the movement, 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 the thinking about, especially with Kate's work, Kate Bornstein's work, I was thinking about how gender is a cult and that family is a cult, and these things really appealed to me. And I suppose I went along to Transgender Victoria meetings, talks by people like Julianne Peters and who was that other person? Anna someone. Anna Langley? Yeah. And also when I travelled to Sydney, I read sort of like sex positive feminist work and stuff around sexual subcultures, lesbian, transgender. I read the work of Patrick Califia, who was then writing as Pat Califia, but then latterly also Patrick. So many writers, and it could have been possible for me to transition at that time if I was really willing to commit to it, but I was already in a lot of economic insecurity and instability. I found myself homeless at different points, squatting as well. I had to do sex work. I wouldn't call it survival sex work. It was a kind of survival sex work, but not only. It was also exploring intimacies in different ways and trying to understand my sexuality. Of course, the body thing was always a bit of a block, but, because I never felt connected to this downstairs. And really that is the stumbling block for those of us who are trans and seek medical transition in this case. So that's the long and short of it. I guess my path through making sense of these things in my writing, well, thinking critically about the nuclear family, about the heteronormative order, although that wasn't the term that we used, heterosexist order, reading feminism, doing sex work, leading a life of someone a bit itinerant. But when I got to university and got through university, the first thesis that I wrote, that is for honours, was on the figure of the sex worker in Latin American literature. And that basically started my academic career. No one else was going there. I drew on the work of Shannon Bell, Reading the Prostitute Body, because that's what was happening in my life. I was in that milieu and I was thinking about these issues. I was thinking about sex, sexuality, and gender at the same time. But being in academia, I had this sort of reverse pressure to not be out as trans and to just consolidate. But I did, as someone who was pretty much trans on the down low, to put it that way. Always trans, right? Always fucking trans. There's no doubt about it. I wrote about trans stuff and I got involved and became active in trans activism in the 2000s. So when people ask me that question, is this thing recent? Of course I have to say no. I've always known I'm trans. Transition and the ability to carry out medical transition is another thing, as well as social transition. And that's my life now. So I'm really glad that I got to this point after so many years of kind of, living almost a nom de plume, living out someone else's life for the sake of other people. But now I can see the whole longue durée of it, the pattern, the sense of it, and that's why I was drawn to all of that work. That's why I engaged with these discourses. That's why I was active in those spaces. being a kind of trans non-binary person, but also like someone that basically wanted to have a different bodily orientation in the world. And just as an adult person, like realizing that means I'm female identified, and that's also in terms of how I feel about my sexuality as well, that I'm trans, feminine, and romantically attracted to women. So it's been a long journey, and it's really exciting to recommence this path with all the pitfalls, including when you're older, but I'm grateful. I'm so blessed. I am so blessed, especially with people who embrace me, who love me, who hold a space for me. It's just phenomenal, and it's so lovely to find family and community, including here in India, you know, and to be seen, really. Tonight, someone addressed me as she, pointing at me, and I'm like, you got it, you know. It's amazing. It's amazing to turn full circle, to come back to myself, the person that I was always meant to be,